Hello everyone, welcome to your next section for this chapter. Today we are going to extend our knowledge of functions and parameters. I'm also going to teach you this concept called scope. Function parameters are really useful because what happens when you want to accept some amount of parameters but you don't want to be explicit or require a set amount of parameters to come in. You want to maybe just give it a bunch of additional parameters or something. So using the args and keyword args functions for parameters is going to be very useful for you in some cases that I'm going to go into and show you. And then we want to talk a little bit about scope. Think about when we're building functions, guys, and then when you use your own functions or other people's functions in your own code. Imagine what happens if, like, maybe they use x as a variable and you use x as a variable. What would happen to those functions? Maybe they would break. Maybe they would not work as you would expect them to because you've saved some value in a value that that function needs. And this is why we talk about scope, because in order for our functions to work with other people's code that we're not always familiar with every single line of and what they use, having an understanding of how we talk about global and local parameters, the scope is going to be extremely important. So what you're going to learn today is you're going to learn about how to use the args and keyword args function or features in a function. We're going to learn how to build the syntax around that and what that looks like once you pass parameters into that. And then we're going to talk about global and local variables as well. We're not going to have a traditional syntax section, guys, because there's not really much syntax that's added. The keywords and arg stuff is kind of basically very similar to how you build your regular functions. You just pass them into your braces. So rather than that, we're going to kind of just play with it a little bit more. So here are our definitions, guys. So our asterisk args is a parameter that you can pass into a function that when defining a function, it'll allow you to pass through an infinite amount of ordered variables. So you can have your parentheses when you're calling that function just like have a bunch of different values just put into it, and it's not going to break saying it doesn't know what to do with those parameters because you haven't named them or something. So it can accept all infinite amount of parameters to then deal with as you see fit. The keyword arguments parameter, as you see here, essentially how you build those is that you have an infinite amount of variables, but you give a keyword for each of those variables as you do it. And that's useful because, like, maybe you want to say, oh, like, you want to build some like default parameters, and if those parameters change in some way, you can use the keywords argument to say, okay, well, in this function we have like step size in our range function. We want to adjust the step size keyword argument or something like that in our own custom function. Okay, as I said before, guys, we don't exactly have a traditional syntax section for this one, so we're just going to go into Python. So I have built a script called scope test, as you see here, and I have created 3 arguments here. I've created three functions. I've created this one called scope test, this one called args test, and another called quargs or keyword arguments test. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to try and run this, and this first script, or this first set of commands here, you're going to see is just scope test is going to run, and we're going to see an interesting behavior that occurs when we do this. You'll notice that I've initialized an x variable up top before, and then I'm going to have it print x plus 5, and then actually try and add to the parameter rather than just like printing it, and see what happens with this. So I called this scope test, as you see here. So I'm going to go Python scope test.py, and okay, it says local variable x referenced before assignment, unbound variable. What's that all about? Okay, let's try and remove this now and see what happens. That works just fine. Okay, that's really weird, guys. So this printed 5, 10, no problem, but it said at line 4 here, there was a problem when we had this piece in. Look at that, let's try that again. It's saying, oh, you know, I tried to run this function, and then at line 4, it couldn't do this because it found that there was a local variable was referenced before the assignment. So it's saying that there's a confusion between this x being in a locally in a function and the x being global out here. So what it's thinking at the moment is that x is actually a local variable that works within this function only. And how a local variable works is that local variables are basically when you have a function and you're defining variables within that function, Python knows that those variables are only to be used within that function. So you don't have X mixing in your own code when you then call a function, all right? But sometimes you might actually want a global variable in there. So how would we do that? We would just tell this function that X is actually global. It's not local at all. And let's see what happens this time. Runs just fine. Actually, if we now print X here, it should be, 6. Let's try that again. Yeah, 6 there. So that's because there was confusion from Python thinking that when it defined this scope that X was a local variable and that you can't, because X was a local variable and it wasn't defined previously when here, it was getting confused. It found, okay, it could print X because print handles global variables, but there was no local variable X here, even though it was called outside. When it's outside of a function, these variables are global. When they're inside a function, variables that you create in the function are local variables, and that can only be referenced within the function itself. You could, if this was, y we created a function called y, or a variable called y in here, you can't call y outside of it. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you guys is the args parameter in Python. So we have this thing called args test at the moment here, and I'm going to call this function args test, and I'm going to pass into it a bunch of variables. Now notice here that I have a bunch of numbers. I'll just put tree here, and we have a bunch of variables here, but they haven't been called or established in this function. And when we did our last section, if we did this, this would error out. But because we're using this asterisk arguments nomenclature, Python knows that, okay, so at this point, you can pass in any amount of variables, and they're going to be stored in this args object. So we're going to run this. I'm going to show you what the args type comes out as and what we'll print when we run this args test function. Let's give it a shot. Oh, so we had an issue. Oh yeah, so we were still calling scope test. I'm going to comment out scope test so it doesn't break. We'll try that again. Okay, so args is a tuple. So let's actually just print args now that we know it's a tuple, and it printed each element, no problem, okay? So it looks like with args, if you pass in some variables, it's going to turn this whole set of variables into a tuple that you can then iterate across, no problem, all right? So that's how you build a function that you might not know how many parameters are coming in, but you'll want to deal with every parameter that does in one command like that. So how do we get keyword arguments to work? Keywords test. We're going to go x equals 3, y equals 2. Remember that with keyword arguments, and I'll just enter this out so you can look at it a little easier. With keyword arguments, you need to actually give it a label. So we're saying in this case we want to pass in 3. Let's do 5 here, like that one, and that is x and y. And so let's see what happens when we now do our keyword arguments function or command. Oops. Try that here. There we go. So now it's a dictionary. So keyword arguments is a dictionary. And then when you print keyword arguments, the items, it will return to you a tuple with the key and the value. Let's actually just print keyword arguments on its own as well and see what comes out of this. Because now that we know it's a dictionary, what do we expect it to look like? There you go. So when you pass in keyword arguments, it's almost like you're passing in a dictionary and you're just labeling each variable as the key and the value pair. Whereas in our args here, it was like you were passing in a list or a tuple, because a tuple, we don't want it to be mutable. So it's passing in a tuple that you can then iterate across. All right, guys, with that, why don't we close it up right now? So what did we learn today? We learned about the args and keyword argument parameters that you can use to build in functions. And we also learned about this concept of global and local parameters and why it's important to think of scope when building functions in code. When you start to import functions in from pandas or some other library, I'm sure at some point or another, you're using a variable name that they're using as well. And because we have this global and local scope, it makes it possible for our code not to interact in really weird ways with other people's code that we don't know everything about. So knowing about global and local scope is critical and important. With that in mind, guys, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lecture.